ASML inadvertently reported their Q3 earnings early, and shareholders were not liking what they were seeing. Shares are down over 17% over the past 5 days. On today's show, we'll go through some of the reasons why the stock is down big. Can you step in and buy this one? We'll have to look at this technically. And when it comes to semiconductor companies, particularly one of ASML stature, we do have to talk a little bit about politics. We've got an election just several weeks away, and we have to talk, is the policy of export controls, which the company more or less cited as one of the reasons why bookings and revenue is coming up a little bit lighter in subsequent quarters. We'll talk about if we had a change of administration, will that change the export restrictions or will those remain in place? And ASML could continue to struggle. We'll talk about that and more on today's show. What is going on, investors? Hopefully you guys are doing well out there. I thought about holding this one off until the weekend when we do our normally semiconductor show on Saturdays or sometimes Sundays. Well, I decided to bring it to you here a little bit earlier because we've got an interesting situation brewing with ASML. Obviously a world leader in lithography machines, the machines responsible for producing all of the leading edge chips that are going in data centers and also cell phones as well. Now, ASML over the past 5 days has seen its share price fall from over $800 per share. Now we're sitting under $700 per share, down over 17% just over the past 5 days. Even the past month paints a very similar story. Now, the company inadvertently reported their Q3 earnings. They made its way onto the ASML website, and that got put out to the broader markets. We'll go through the numbers here in a moment. The revenue, the profit, the gross margins, all those types of things that we normally look at. We'll look at the balance sheet and cash flows. And for the most part, the most recent quarter was not bad. Revenue more or less came in line with expectations, but we got a couple of data points for the upcoming quarters. And that third quarter bookings, and bookings is the business that the company is booking in that business, which they'll deliver at a later date, as these machines that ASML makes are incredibly complex and do take some time to put together. Well, unfortunately, those bookings fell 53% quarter over quarter to just 2.63 billion euros. Now, all of the figures that we'll be reporting on today are in euros. If I mix euros and dollars, please forgive me. I believe the exchange rate is off by about 10%. You could factor those in if you really want to get into the nitty gritty. However, here's the most important thing is that the consensus estimate for bookings in the most recent quarter was for 5.4 billion euros. So when the company announced 2.6 billion euros of bookings, well, that was well below expectations. Now, in terms of the fourth quarter revenue, this is revenue that they're actually going to book in the quarter. The company is expecting sales between 8.8 up to 9.2 billion. That gives you a midpoint of about $9 billion in revenue. And the estimate was right there at about $9 billion. I'm currently seeing, at least from the analysts that have adjusted their targets over the past day or so, that Wall Street is now expecting about $9.9 billion of revenue. My guess is that number might come in just a little bit, but with those soft booking numbers, that is advanced revenue that is coming in subsequent quarters, well, it's taken the shine off potentially of future quarters for this company, as we're seeing growth decelerate as you move into Q3 and Q4 of next year. Wall Street is expecting virtually no growth for a company that is valued at over $285 billion. That will likely get adjusted down in the coming days and weeks ahead as the share price is taking a hit. And you've got a forward price to earnings multiple, which is elevated over some of its peers in the semiconductor industry, currently sitting at about 36 times. Sometimes it's actually been higher the times I've looked at ASML. Well, no growth on the revenue estimates as we move into next year. A year from now certainly is not going to cut it from a valuation perspective, and that is one of the reasons why the stock is taking a major hit. From a graphical perspective, this shows you that quarterly net bookings of that 2.6 billion euro mark. Well, it has sat there before. Ironically, a year ago, you had a print just under that. So it could be something to do with the Q3. It could be something to do with the way these large semiconductor manufacturers that are buying this type of equipment, maybe for whatever reason, all of their buying agents take a vacation in the Q3, and then they come back in the Q4, and you had a big bounce back with ASML. Whether or not that occurs could have something to do with the export controls that we've seen, particularly over the past 8 years, or maybe 7 years to be more specific, here in the United States, or maybe even just over the past 4 or 5 years. There's always been a tension on the semiconductor industry, particularly companies like ASML, Taiwan Semiconductor, the other equipment manufacturers like Applied Materials, Lam Research, KLA, and many others, as it relates to national security. That is because you have countries that may be viewed as adversarial to the United States, like maybe the country of Russia, or certainly maybe even the country of China. They get their hands on this equipment, and they're able to produce the same semiconductor equipment that you can here in the United States. Part of former President Donald Trump's plan when his term was underway was he was trying to boost the exports that the United States was sending into the country of China. In fact, he signed a trade deal with China. And what happened is that exports of semiconductor and equipment was very, very high. However, all the other exports were not necessarily as good as promised, at least during the early stages of that trade agreement. Now, the Trump administration ended up revising the semiconductor agreement, very similar to what we've seen under President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. They've put restrictions on the type of semiconductors, particularly the leading edge semiconductor made by NVIDIA, Intel, AMD, and certainly companies like ASML, which again make the lithography machines, which more or less manufacture all of those chips. Well, those export restrictions are not allowing this company to sell its machines and its equipment into the country of China, which would likely be the biggest buyer of this equipment outside of the United States and certainly Taiwan. So the long and short of it is, I don't think we're going to see a major change here. I think in a couple of weeks, if you have a former President Trump become the current president again, I think he's more or less going to adopt the policy that was in place when his administration ended, and that he's trying to boost certain types of exports into the country of China, but he's probably not going to allow the leading edge semiconductors. And we have to assume, at least at the current time, that current Vice President Kamala Harris will adopt some of probably not only the policies, but maybe even some of the staff members that are in the current regime that are recommending these types of export curbs, because I guarantee you none of the candidates, including the current president, really understand these things, but they certainly have staff that are advising them on this, and more or less those people will continue to do that. That is bad news, more or less, for ASML. Certainly, again, as we start to look forward in the coming several quarters, unless we have a dramatic change in policy in terms of exporting and allowing, particularly the country of China, access to leading edge semiconductor equipment, it will put a damper on ASML's demand for their lithography machines. It will also dampen pricing and gross margins, which we saw in the most recent quarter, at least year over year. Gross profit slipped from 51.9 down to 50.8. When you have less competition for those machines, well, it means that the current buyers might not have to pay up as much. Now, in terms of the sales and machines that ASML is able to sell, the performance is about what you would expect. $7.5 billion worth of net sales. You had gross profit coming in at $3.8 billion. You still have to R&D these things, continue to innovate like this company has done, particularly over the past really 20 years or so. Research and development coming in at about $1 billion. They don't have to spend a lot on sales when your product is one of the only ones that can, or in fact, the only machine that can produce particularly the leading edge type of chips. You don't have to spend a lot on sales and marketing. Your income from operations off of 7.5 billion euros, came in about 2.4 billion. Flow down to net income, you're right at about 2 billion. That compares favorably to the previous year at 1.9. If you stretch this out to the 9-month ended, doesn't paint as favorable of view from an operating perspective, not only from a revenue perspective, but net income perspective, but quarter over quarter or year over year on a quarterly basis, it wasn't that bad. Now, the company is fine financially. They still have plenty of cash. They still have plenty in receivables. They have a fair amount of inventory as well. That's kind of showing you, I think, some of the impact of the export controls is because these companies plan these things out probably years in advance. We had $8.9 billion of inventory last year. Now it's at $11.4 billion. You do have some long-term debt sitting down here, but it's just nothing to really be concerned about. So you do have some political pressures and national security risk that is perceived by the United States and its politicians. That is hurting the company, but they have a solid enough position from a balance sheet perspective. You as a shareholder don't have to include that really, I don't think, as a major risk. From a cash flow perspective, in the most recent quarter, we pulled down that $2 billion in net income. We have about $1 billion, or about $950 million in terms of net cash provided by operating activities. And again, this is a $285 billion company. These are impressive financials, but it does have to be taken in the context that the valuation on this one is often pumped up because it has such a large moat around its current business. Now, they do have to invest in property, plant, and equipment, and they do pay a dividend as well, more or less over the last year, at least on a quarterly basis. You are more or less neutral from a cash flow perspective. If you stretch this out to a yearly basis, they have burned through some cash primarily because of buying back treasury shares or stock, dividends. They've also repaid some debt over the past year. So the outlook is not rosy for ASML. I would expect the elections here in the United States to play somewhat of a role in this company's future. So if you're not comfortable analyzing United States politics, or you can't do it from a rational perspective, well, this would probably be a company that I would not touch. Now, here's what I will say is I do believe that either administration, whether it's the Harris or Trump administration that takes over, I would expect the export curbs and export restrictions to likely stay in place for at least a short period of time, maybe potentially for the entire 4-year of their initial term. However, what I will say about President Trump, and I think we can all agree on him, is that he is a wild card. Out of both candidates, whether it's Harris or Trump, Trump is the one candidate where I could see changing his mind on the export curbs or coming to some kind of deal with China that allows the company to buy that. And if that's the case, then ASML will have a rapid rise in its share price if the market of China is opened up. And I think Trump is the only president that would really, really change his mind. Although I don't think we know enough about President Harris to know what she would do in this situation. But you have to assume she's more or less a career politician, and career politicians tend to stay with the status quo. Now, this is creating an opportunity in ASML. We are still in a long-term uptrend. We'll change this to a monthly view on the chart just so you get a longer time frame on the chart. And you see ASML for the long term, really since 1996, this one has been in an uptrend, and more specifically since 2003, when many of you were likely in grade school or high school or maybe college like I was. This one has been in a longer term uptrend. You've had just a handful of months where you could have bought this at the bottom of the channel. And at least at the current time, this is where this one looks like it wants to head. We are still in this uptrend. An uptrend is a series of higher highs followed by a series of higher lows. We have just confirmed a new higher high. This was back in July at about $1,100 per share. Now we are sitting at $689 per share. This is why even with stocks like this, even when they are in these massive uptrends, we put a red line at the top of the trend saying, this is maybe where you want to stop and probably not buy shares. And this is certainly an area where you might want to take a profit if you have one in ASML. But as you approach the middle of the channel, which we dissect usually with these light green lines, that's an area where you could potentially step in on this one. Now, further down is the bottom of the channel where we have a very dark green line saying, well, if you don't buy here, I don't think you can call yourself an investor, and you might want to stick to ETFs and avoid single stocks, because this is the area where you buy, and this is going to be the area where I think you get an opportunity to buy ASML. Now, notice that we do have support at the previous low. So the previous cluster of lows here, before that it's here, before that it is back here, back in 2020. We should find support at about 580, and look what that will converge on. If you go from 689 down to about 580, you converge on the previous lows providing support and also the lower trend line. Now, I'm not saying that you really need to wait for the stock to get all the way down to that level, but somebody that's playing this from a pure technical perspective, letting it judge your decision making, that's about where you would want to start. I would probably be jumping the gun on it just a little bit, and I think you could start buying this one around $615, $600 per share, and I'll certainly step in here at that level as well. It is not going to be easy, though, for ASML, as these export restrictions are choking off a key customer in the country of China. I don't think the upcoming elections will change much, at least in the shorter term, as both candidates have come from administrations that have favored these export curbs. However, I do believe Trump is maybe somewhat of a wild card in a number of different ways, but certainly in his decision making seems a little bit more fluid than traditional politicians. And I view Harris more as a traditional politician and one that would hold the line rather than make big, bold moves. That was ASML. Will join you again this weekend. I'll likely be on the road, so we'll see how the show gets put together, but I'll join you again this weekend. Thanks for tuning in today. Good luck with your investments.